Holly Hurd was raised in a small town in Idaho and attended school at the University of California at Berkeley and later Cornell, where she received a PhD in molecular biology. She moved to Maine with her family in 2001, and after raising two girls, she began volunteering and later working in the field of history. She graduated with a master's degree from the University of Southern Maine's American and New England Studies program in 2013 and worked as an educator, archivist, and curator at the Osher Map Library, North Yarmouth, and Freeport Historical Societies before becoming the executive director of Tate House Museum in May of 2020. She has published 2 illustrated history books and written various historical articles. So Holly, thank you so much for joining us today, and we are really looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Tina. I'm just working on sharing my screen here. Here we go. And I would like to thank Tina White for inviting me to speak about the Tate House. The Tate House is a very interesting property, as you're about to hear, and I'm sure all of the Great American Treasures are interesting properties, but I'm excited to talk about the history a little bit here. The title of my talk is A Look at the Past and the Future, and I would like to give you, the past part of it will be, I'll give you a little bit of historical background, and then I'd also like to talk a little bit about some of the programming and some activities that we have planned for the future. Okay, I'm trying to advance my slide and it's not advancing. So I'm going to try ending the show and just starting again and see if that will help. That worked. Okay, great. Can everyone see what we're looking at? The Tate House Museum here, Tate House. So this is a photograph of the Tate House, and it was built in 1755 for George and Mary Tate, who actually moved there from England. George had been hired very recently. He actually, we believe they moved in 1751, and he had been hired as the senior mast agent for this particular area of, it was at that time called Falmouth, it's now Portland, Maine. And what his job was to work with contractors who were working with the British Crown. The Royal Navy in particular were looking for these. Over here on the left side of your screen, we see a photograph of a eastern white pine. And these trees were very much in demand to be used for the masts for Royal Navy vessels. And the reason that they were in demand is that by the 17th century, all of the timber had been used up in England. And so they were looking beyond to some of their colonies to supply them. One of the reasons that England was able to become the Great British Empire, probably the main reason, was because of their Navy. They had a very strong Navy, and so they needed to keep on building these naval ships. These tall trees were very, very strong, and they grew and still continue to grow. If they're not harvested, they can grow up to 200 feet tall, actually. Most of the ones they harvested were at least 24 inches in diameter, but they would grow 3 or even 4 feet in diameter, and 100, 120, even 150 feet tall. So they provided these fantastic masts for the British Navy. And when the king realized that there was this resource in the colonies, he decided to start marking the trees with what became known as the King's Broad Arrow. And as Tina and I were talking about, this symbol that's shown here at the bottom, it's just a sort of an arrow, became a symbol of British ownership. So lots of other things were marked. Anything that belonged to the king or the British government was marked with this broad arrow. And so the king started marking the trees in the colonies with this broad arrow, meaning that it belonged to him. And as you'll see with time, that actually became a sore subject for the colonists because the trees were very valuable. Each of them could go for something like I think it was 1,500 pounds. So it was a lot of money that each of these tall trees was valued at. And people eventually became very unhappy about the king claiming them. But to begin with, in the colonial period, there were a lot of these trees that were being harvested. So George Tate had actually been involved in the mass trade in the Baltics and earlier in his time period. He was born in 1700. So when he came to the colonies, when he came to the Portland area, he was in his 50s. But he was the senior mast agent, which meant that he was involved in surveying, harvesting, and shipping of what they called white pine sticks. So people, first the surveyors would go out into the woods and they would mark with the King's Broad arrow any trees that were 24 inches in diameter or wider and claim those. And then they had woodsmen who chopped them down, carried them to the mass landing, which I'll show you a picture was actually in this area, was right in front of George Tate's house. And they would work on making 16 sides so that they would be able to fit in the mass ships. And so those were called sticks. And so then those got shipped over to England on these giant mass ships. Now, one of the things I want to point out that's special about this particular house is it is a National Historic Landmark. And I'm sure many of the Dames properties are. And the reason that it has that status is because there are very few of these colonial time period houses that are associated with the mass trade that survive. And that's because of the history that happened after that the American Revolution ended up completely stopping the mass trade, obviously. And many of the people that were involved in the mass trade fled because they were loyalists. And it was unusual that that didn't happen with George Tate. George Tate actually ended up staying through the American Revolution. And he lived in this house until he died in 1794. And so we'll talk a little bit about why that was the case. As I said, many other people who were strongly associated with the British Crown ended up leaving, and then they therefore didn't have their house to continue on. And so it's unusual that we have this wonderful house to represent the mass trade in the Portland, Maine area. So the other thing I want to mention is that this is the oldest public building in Cumberland County, and there's a couple of reasons for that, which I'll show you on the next slide. Oh, it seems like we're going to have a problem with it not wanting to advance, so bear with me here. So here's a map that shows Portland. I don't know if any of you have been to Portland, but Portland is, this is called actually Falmouth Neck, or the Portland area. And you can see this here is the area where the wharfs are, now what's currently Commercial Street. So the area of Portland proper is out on this neck and peninsula, and where George Tate built his house is actually here. And so that's another reason that it's the oldest. There are colonial era, there were colonial era houses, but many of them were destroyed during the Revolution. Portland is known as the Phoenix City. Its motto is Resurgam, which means we'll rise again. And the reason is it's been burned extensively at least twice during history. One during the Revolution, one of the British sea captains actually pulled one of his large ships right along here in the Fore River, and he released a number of cannons that ended up burning a big chunk of Portland. So a lot of the historic buildings were lost then. And of course, here is the Tate House way upriver. This is the Fore River. And so it was not bombed during that period. Another big fire that happened in Portland was in 1866 on the 4th of July. A young man was playing with firecrackers and started a fire that burned down, especially the East End, a lot of this area of Portland. So a lot of historic buildings were lost. There are houses that are owned by people who in other areas of Cumberland County inland. But as I said, it's the oldest one that is publicly owned and therefore open as a museum. So that makes it pretty special. So before George Tate came as the mast agent, there was a mast agent whose name was Thomas Westbrook. And he was born in 1674, lived 70 years until 1744. He came to Portland area as the mast agent in 1727. This is a map from the 1770s, actually showing one of the important features of Maine's coastline, as you may realize, is that it had a lot of rivers that moved inland. And so the rivers were fantastic areas to help with the harvest of the white pine trees, because they were actually just put in the rivers and then sent down that way. And so Thomas Westbrook started in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, which was one of the earliest big areas where they started the mass trade, because of the river there. The Piscataqua River was a nice place to flow in the giant mass trees, the sticks. But when that became depleted, they had to start moving up the coast. And so he came from Portsmouth and became the mast agent, as I said, in 1727. And he settled first here in Stroudwater. He actually started, this is what's known as Long Creek. So just to give you a little view of where we are here, this is the Portland Neck that I just showed you, or the Falmouth Neck. And then this is the Fore River. And this is the river that's called the Stroudwater River. So Thomas Westbrook built his actually fort. It was a house that was garrisoned. He had established his career as he had many interactions with the native people. And so he actually was aware that at the time, before and during the French and Indian Wars, what are now known as that, in the 1750s, it was there was a lot of conflict, native settler conflict. And so this is actually an old map from the 1740s that shows a little drawing of Thomas Westbrook's house. And so this is the Stroudwater River. So the place that he built his home was just on the other side of the Stroudwater River. The Tate house ends up being built right about here, where I'm showing my arrow. So it's at the confluence basically of the Stroudwater River and the Fore River. And as I said, the masts all came down and were plowed into the, put into the Fore River. This area here was the mast yard, as I said, just in front of the Tate house. So back to this house here that Thomas Westbrook built, you can tell that it was a garrisoned house, a fort. He called it Harrow House. He also built a dam across the Stroudwater River and established, you can see it says sawmills. He also had a paper mill and a grist mill in this area. So he really started developing the region of Stroudwater during an early date. Now, Thomas Westbrook's partner was a man named Brigadier General Samuel Waldo. There are his dates there. And you can see from this wonderful painting of him that is actually at the Bowdoin College of Art that he was quite the gentleman. And he was Thomas Westbrook's partner, but basically a financial partner, that they worked on purchasing some of the wild lands in Maine so that they could then cut the trees down and send them over to England. And they were business partners, but something happened along the way, because Thomas Westbrook was the one who actually had a house there, lived there. We don't think that Samuel Waldo ever really lived or spent much time in the Portland area. He mostly lived in Boston. So he was the financial partner, but something happened during their relationship, and we're not sure what, but the relationship went south, and Samuel Waldo started saying that Thomas Westbrook owed him money. And by the time Thomas Westbrook died in 1744, he was in debt to Waldo. And so what happened was that when he died, his family actually spirited his body away and hid it on his nephew's farm in Westbrook, and so, which is the next town over, and that's named after him, obviously. And this actually, his skeleton was discovered during the bicentennial. They had an archaeological dig in 1976. This top part shows that they actually found the plate on the coffin said the remains of his name, which would have been Thomas Westbrook. It just said HOS and then WEST 70 years, which is how old he was when he died. So we know that this is the body of Thomas Westbrook. And the theory as to why he was hidden there for so many years is that back in those days when someone owed someone else a debt, Samuel Waldo would have been able to collect his body and keep his remains, as they called it, until his debts were paid. And so that's why his body was hidden. So that's kind of an interesting part of the story. So after Thomas Westbrook died, even though they didn't find his body, Waldo confiscated all of the land that he had, including his house. So this is a map from 1756 that shows actually Westbrook's holdings that then became part of Waldo's holdings. So this is, it says it's a plan of the land that Samuel Waldo owns. And this is the Strawwater River. And again, this is the enclosure that was the Harrow House where Thomas Westbrook lived. He's got, these are the mill sites and the road that crosses. And this is called the mill land. This was land where they had a sheep pasture and a calf pasture and a wheat pasture and the barn area. So he actually acquired all of these lands. And this is an interesting map because it shows the Tate House, because as I mentioned, the Tate House was built in 1755. So there's the Tate House right there. These are some other old houses that remain. These old houses on this side of the road actually are still there. The what's called the Isaac Fly House, the Richard Forder House, the David Patrick House, and the Tate House. All of the older houses that were then on this side of the river have not survived. So after Thomas Westbrook, there was a period of time when no one was watching over the mass trade in this area. So as I said, he died in 1744. So I think they quickly realized they had people that were taking the trees, colonists who were harvesting and making money. So they decided that they needed someone to come and become the senior mast agent. So they hired George Tate. And George and Mary Tate came with 4 of their children. They were all sons. They had actually had 2 other children where they lived in near London, and 2 of them had died. George, oops, I got to go back. A child named George and a child named Mary. So we actually believe that we know that they lived in a suburb of London called Rotherhithe. And here's a picture of it. It was right on the Thames, which would make sense for someone who was involved in the sea. It's near the Tower of London. So here's Rotherhithe. They were members of St. Mary's Church. I'm showing. Can you all see, hopefully you can see my pointer. It was right about here. And here's a picture of it today. It's a very old church and they actually have records. And recently I found this record, which may or may not be William Tate, but they did have a son named William Tate. So, and we know that all of the children were born there and baptized in this church. So this says William Tate, son of George and Mary, in Pell Street. The reason I think this is Pell is I looked at every possible, I can't really see this, but I think it's E-L-L. There is a street called Pell Street that's right about here. Whether that's where the Tates lived, we don't know, but we do know that they came from Rotherhithe about 1751. Robert had been born in January of 1751, and we think that when he was old enough that they actually traveled to the colonies at that time. This is a model that actually is in the Tate House that sort of shows the holdings that George Tate had. So, and what the area would have looked like at the time that he built his house. So here's the Tate House at the top of the hill. Now there's all kinds of houses around here, obviously, but at the time that he built his house in 1755, there was the other house that I showed you that's not shown that would have been down over the hill a little bit. But we know that George Tate had started out with a warehouse that was near the water. And this is a stylized version of what we think the warehouse would have looked like based on some warehouses that are in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And what we believe is that he may have lived with his family in the upper floor of this warehouse until he got his house built, which is a very large house and would have taken some years to build. We also know that George is actually listed in tax records as a merchant, and we think that we know that he had a store. So this is supposed to represent his store, and that it was on the road going up towards his house. This is just a picture of one of these white pines. Again, this is a stylized model, so don't know that there's a white pine right there. But also, this is a version of a mast ship. And the mast ships actually didn't come right up there because the water, this is tidal, and so this becomes a mud flat at low tide. So I'll show you a map where the mast ships did come. They didn't actually come all the way up here. But this was the mast yard, and you can see some sticks in the yard. So what they would have done is they would have collected these logs and then converted them to sticks, and then they would have strapped them together and just towed them down to the place that they could have been loaded onto the mast ships. Here is a map that shows what I was just talking about. So here's the Falmouth Neck that I was mentioning, which is now Portland. Here's the location, that little triangle is the location of George Tate's house, right between the Strawwater River and the Fore River. And so this is, as I said, that's where the mast yard was, right in front of his house, as shown in the model. And so they strapped the sticks together, took them down here. And this is the area, Clark's Point, where the mast ships were able to come. So they came all the way through the Falmouth Harbor, and the channel is very deep there. So they loaded them onto mast ships here, and then they turned around and headed to England. So I want to talk a little bit about the sons and what we know about them. They're kind of an interesting family in that two of them we think were more or less loyalists, and the other two were sort of patriots. And you know that line is hard to define. You know, what does that actually mean? But we know that Samuel, the oldest son, was a mast ship captain. We have records showing that he was bringing, so he was the captain of some of these mast ships. That's what he did for a living. And after the revolution, or during the revolution, he actually ended up going back to England, and he spent a lot of time there. So we think that he may have been a little more attached to the loyalist perspective there. The second son, William, was a merchant. He was the one that was kind of the most different from all of his brothers. He was the only one who didn't follow the sea in some way. And he sort of, you know, took after his father. He's the one that inherited the house when his father died, and he stayed in the area. And as I said, took over his father's store. I'll talk more about William in a second. George, who we call Admiral George to distinguish him from his father, George Sr., actually became an admiral in the Russian Navy. And the only photographs or images that we have of any of the Tate family are of Admiral George. So this is from a miniature in the Portland Museum of Art of Admiral George, and this is a painting that we actually have in the Tate house of him. He spent his entire career being, you know, over there, basically being an admiral in the Russian Navy, which we believe his connections, he got the connections through his father. Robert was the one who was more of a patriot in that he stayed in the area. He married a local woman that was from Stroudwater, but he did some trading in the West Indies. So he also was a ship captain or a merchant involved in the various trades. He actually died in the West Indies in Berbice, which is British Guyana, and when he was a fairly young man. So we know that he was down there a lot doing some trading in the West Indies. So now I want to go back to William. William has a bit of a sad story, and it's a story that we tell when people come in to do tours of the Tate house. William actually accidentally killed his mother when she was young. So she was only 60 years old. So what happened was that the story that we know, all we know is we just have this oral tradition story that comes down. And so the story is that someone was stealing from the storehouses at the Tate house. And so she asked her husband to rig up some kind of a system to keep them from doing it. And he didn't want to because he thought it'd be dangerous. But apparently William, who was about 30 years old at the time, decided to take the matter into his own hands. And he actually rigged up a gun that when the door would open, the gun went off. And for reasons that are not clear, Mary didn't seem to know about where the gun was located, that she needed something from the storehouse. And so she opened the door and was shot in the abdomen and actually died instantly. And so anyway, this unfortunate accident sort of cast a shadow on the Tate family, and William was the instigator. He actually was. He pled guilty, and he was sentenced to death, but then he was pardoned by the king. So everyone knew it was an accident. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about the history of the house ownership. So we have George Tate, who built the house in 1755. He died in 1794. As I mentioned, his son William got the house in 1794. William actually had all kinds of problems and ended up in bankruptcy by 1803 and lost the house at that time. And he actually ended up going back to England because he was in debt. And he never returned, or didn't return for a long period of time, because he left some members of his family here. So it's a little bit unclear as to what happened with William, but we know that he did die in the London area. The house then passed for a short time to a man named Samuel Parkman, and then Dr. Calvin Thomas had it for 50 years, almost 50 years. John Anderson for the latter half of the 19th century. And then a man who was quite interested in history owned it right before the Dames. And so the Dames actually purchased it, the National Society of Colonial Dames of America in the state of Maine, purchased it in 1931. The Dames were involved in, because obviously they're interested in historic preservation. The house had, these are some pictures of the house over time in 1890, 1910, 1931 when the Dames bought it, and then in the 1950s. And so, of course, what they wanted to do was to restore it back to its original 1755 format. And that was something that took some time, and they undertook a huge renovation. You can see that one of the things that had happened, and one of the things that's most interesting about the architecture of the house, is it has something called a clerestory, or a subsumed dormer. And you can see that that had actually been covered over at some point in the 19th century. And here's a photo just showing that it's covered over. So the historian I mentioned, Andrew Hawes, who lived in the neighborhood, he actually had that taken back to its original sort of subsumed dormer. This is something, a characteristic and architectural feature that we don't see much in Maine. The only other known structure of that kind of clerestory is at the Burnham Tavern up in down east in Maine, in a place called Machias. So anyway, he restored that about 1900. So this is what the house looked like, as I mentioned, when the Dames had it. And it had been used as a, because it's a large house, it had been separated out and was kind of a tenement house where they had different people living in the house. So it had been sort of split in half, and they had people living on this side and people living on this side. So for many years during the 18th century, early 20th century, 19th century and early 20th century, it had been used as a rental property. And so it had lots of things inside it that were kind of changed, and the Dames wanted to bring it back to its original 1755. This is showing some of the work. This is the back of the house that the Dames were doing. And one of the things that they did, you can see that they worked on renovating the L. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit in a minute. There's just another picture from 1895 showing the enclosure of the subsumed dormer that then got sent back to its original form. This is actually an important painting that we own. It's a watercolor painting by John Bradley Hudson that was done in 1879. And this house in the front is called the Means House. We actually, the Dames own this house as well. And this is the Tate House in the background. Interestingly, even though the Tate House appears to be on a hill, if you stand right in this spot, it looks exactly like that. And so one of the things we just noted recently is that this subsumed dormer has been covered over, so that we know that it was covered over sometime before 1879, because this appears to be a very realistic image, painting of this area. So this right here is actually a schoolhouse. This is a very charming picture. So here is a postcard from 1910 showing some of the tenants who lived in the Tate House at the time. We don't actually know who they are. And this is 1926, again, very similar to what it would have looked like when the Dames got the property in 1931. So they began some extensive renovations, preservation work in the 30s. They did quite a lot of work to help keep the house up and change it back to its original form, as I mentioned. Another thing they did is they hired an archaeologist. This man named Walter Macomber had actually done some archaeological digs. This is him here in the suit, had done some digs in Mount Vernon. So he's a well-known, prominent archaeologist. So I love this because archaeologists now don't stand on the edge and wearing a suit. They're actually in the hole with the man who's digging. So anyway, they discovered something very interesting here. This is on the eastern side of the house. What Walter Macomber discovered is that there had once been an L there that had been taken down actually in the 18th century. And so that L was actually rebuilt, and you'll see that now in the pictures of the Tate House. The Tate House Museum was founded as a nonprofit 501c3 in the year 2005. The Dames worked together to establish this nonprofit organization to help run the Tate House and to establish a mission of education. And they had, after 1931, it opened to the public as a museum in 1935. So through all of those years, from 1935 up to 2005, the Dames were running it as a museum. And so they decided that it would be good to actually have an organization overseeing it starting from 2005. The Dames still own this property. And as I said, but it's run by this nonprofit known as Tate House Museum. Here's our current board of directors. Actually, this isn't everyone. We have 12 on our board, but you can see we have a lovely area in the backyard of the Tate House where, at least during the summer months, we often meet and enjoy talking about the workings of Tate House Museum. So for many of you, I think most of you have probably never been to the Tate House. So I just want to bring you inside to show you roughly what it looks like. I hope that if you're visiting that you'll come and have an official tour, because I'm not going to be able to talk about all the things that you'll hear about if you come on a tour, but I just want you to get an idea of what's inside. So when William Tate lost the house in 1803, all of the things inside actually went as well. So the furnishings that we have in here are actually things that were purchased by the dames and later some by the Tate House Museum. Most of them are owned by the dames. And so they are 18th century furnishings that are meant to interpret and look like what it would have looked like during the time that the Tates lived there. So you start out, let me just go back here. So this is the L that I was talking about that was rebuilt. So sometimes we come in through the L on the backside, but mostly we've been coming in through the front door because it's so dramatic to come in through the front door. We go over to the L and there's interpretation about the mast trade in there. And then we enter this area, and then I'll describe how you go around and then up the stairs and then on the second floor. So we start with this area that we call the sitting room. So this would have been an area that where they entertained guests or maybe played games in the evenings where the family would have eaten. And here's a picture of King George and Queen Charlotte on the wall. There's a Book of Common Prayer. There's all kinds of objects in here that I won't have time to go over. I just mostly want you to see what it looks like inside the house. So we go from the sitting room into the kitchen area, which is the back side of the house. So you can see there's a very large hearth here that's got cranes and there's all kinds of interesting, there's the pantry with old barrels and people get to view that and lots of other things. Then we walk through this door and go to the parlor. So this was the fancy room where special guests would have been entertained. And a couple of things over the fireplace area here, there's a very wide board and, opulent molding in the house, all kinds of, also, as I said, all kinds of other furnishings. This is one of the special features of the house. This is called a beaufat or a corner cupboard. And we have some nice items in there for people to see. This is actually not original to the house, but it was reproduced because when the house was owned by the Anderson family, they actually sold it and it's actually, the original is in a house in Windham. And so they used the original one to recreate this in the Tate House. Then we come through the parlor area and go up the stairs. I just want to show you the lovely steep stairs. There's the front door of the house. So you walk up those stairs into the parlor chamber. This would have been the chamber where Mary and George likely slept. It was the nicest room, chamber room in the house. And you see here's their canopied bed, which would have been for privacy and also for warmth. This area here is set with a tea table because they would have actually entertained guests in their room at times. And then to the back of the house, you can see here, this back part, which is over the kitchen hearth, is actually what we call the boys' room. I'm not going to show you that. It's just where the boys might have slept. And so then you go to the left. This is the sitting room chamber where guests could have stayed. And there's all kinds of interesting things in here as well. This is looking out towards the front of the house. So there's a little view of the house. Like I said, whoops, we're going too far forward here. Wanted you to see what it looks like, and hopefully you'll come visit sometime and hear more about the very interesting furnishings inside the house. So as far as what has Tate House Museum been working on, obviously one of our big things that we do is offer tours to the public. And so in order to be able to continue to offer tours and to have a safe place to keep the collections and the furnishings, we need to be able to preserve the house over time. And so we've been working on every year we do preservation projects, and we get grant money and to help us work on things that, the house is 1755. So as you all know, when you've got a house that old, there's always things that need to be kept up. So we actually did a major renovation, preservation project in 2015-16, which involved drainage. So you can see here that they dug these trenches and put this piping in to actually collect the water that came from the downspouts off the gutters. and would send the water down the hill. We've had issues with the moisture in the basement and the runoff there. So one of the things that was interesting about this major project was that we had to do an archaeological dig in order to, make sure that we weren't going to disrupt anything, any interesting archaeological information. So we had an archaeologist, actually the Maine state archaeologist, and a couple other archaeologists who came and helped us during the time that the ground was open. And what we discovered, you see this is a picture of the Tate House before 2016, where we had a brick walkway. And now you'll see that we have a board walkway. And the reason is that the archaeological dig revealed that something like 3 feet down below the surface, this is actually, the surface level here is about 3 feet higher than it was during the 18th century. And so there was a remnants of an old board walkway. So that's why we replaced it with the board walkway. So now we have a board walkway, which would have been, although 3 feet lower, similar to what the Tates would have had in the 18th century. Another major project that we're working on right now, actually, this is our historic preservationist. His name is Caleb Hemphill with Laura Sprague, who's our consulting curator, and they're holding a reconstructed window cornice. So here's a picture of Caleb. This project began in 2011. He's actually he restored 2 of the window cornices on the front of the house, and he replaced the other 2. One of the things that's interesting is that these window cornices, which are on this side of the house, the west side of the house, are the only features of the house, external features of the house, that are original to the house, 1755. But because of that, so the clapboards have been replaced, everything else on the external area of the house has been replaced. And, but you can see they're in pretty tough shape. So that's one of the projects we're working on right now, is that Caleb has reconstructed some window cornices, and he's going to be putting those on the western side of the house. From the 1772 Foundation, we also got a grant to work on the sills. This is our carpenter who's going to be working on that. He pulled off a piece of the sill here because it's so rotten, and he said, sorry, that keeps advancing. He said, should I frown? And I said, yes, absolutely frown when you're holding that rotten piece of wood there. So anyway, he's working on rebuilding those window sills. We also need to do some work on the L roof. So these are just some major projects that we're working on this season. The other thing that we are working on trying to address is that because of climate change, we've had a lot more rainfall, and our gutter system is not working very well. You can see this is showing how when it rains, the gutters, in order to keep the house dry, we need the water to be going down this downspout. And you can see that actually the gutters aren't big enough to accommodate the rainfall. And so we're getting lots of something that we're looking at into the near future. Another issue that's always ongoing is that the chimney, which has been rebuilt and repointed in various times, but lots of original brick. This is a gigantic chimney that it actually has, the chimney guy calls it a jog. In the back, it kind of sticks out like that. It's sort of like, I can think of it like an L of the chimney. And this is a very large chimney, 5 feet or so across. It has 8 fireplaces associated with it. And we have a chimney cap on it. But anyway, the chimney is having some issues. So we recently, this is our intern, whose name is Chris. And Chris actually brought his friend Matt, who owned this wonderful drone. So very recently, he took his drone up and took pictures of the very top. The house is 30 some feet tall. So 35 feet. So it's very tall chimney. So instead of putting a ladder up there or getting a lift, we had this guy come and take pictures with our drone. That was kind of fun. New technology. We talked about what it might have been like, how could George Tate imagine such a contraption taking pictures of his chimney? Anyway, it's kind of fun to see that up there taking pictures. Another project we're working on is we have a 40-year-old fence, sort of privacy fence, that's been between our property and the neighbor on the right. And you can see that we've used ropes to try to tie it up to the trees, and it's in bad shape and needs some help. Actually, I made this little box for donations for a new fence out of a piece of the old fence. So far, this method hasn't worked very well in that we've only gotten, I think, $5 put in there. I don't know if people are nervous about having the money in there, but that's something we're going to be working on, is trying to get donations for a new fence. We also own another historic property. We purchased it in 1997. It's the Means House, and it's right across the road. The Means House was built in 1797, so not a colonial, but it's a federal era house. We use this house for our offices. So this is where people come. There's a visitor center here. This is the upstairs has tenants living there. And so down here is where our offices are. And we have a visitor center, gift shop there as well. You can see that we've had to do various preservation projects here too. In 2018-19, the Means House got a new roof and got a new paint job. So we're also working on trying to keep that historic house up as well. Now I'd like to shift gears and talk a little bit about some of the activities that we did during the pandemic, 2020, even 2021. The key here is that, as many of you know, we've been focusing on doing programming outdoors, which has been challenging because, as I mentioned, a lot of our educational activity focuses on tours in the house, but we sort of had to, like a lot of people, pivot and shift gears and try to find some way to do educational programming in ways that would be safe to both our docents and the public. So last summer, we actually started this program called Inside Out Tours that we offered through July and September. Here's one of our docents wearing a face shield and visitors all wearing masks, but we actually talked to them about the history of the house from the outside. So that's why we call it the Inside Out Tour. So they got to hear about the house history just from outdoors. We had a total of only about 45 visitors all last year, which is not surprising because, you know, people were just, it was the pandemic, but we had a few. This as compared to in 2019, our typical number of visitors a year is 1,000. So you can see that this is very, very different, but we tried to offer something. I thought it was important for us, and still think it's important for us, to try to do what we can along the way. But it's been, like for many historic houses, it's been really, really tough. Another thing we offered is we have a lovely 18th century gardens in the backyard of the Tate House. This has lots of medicinal plants that would have been used by the Tates. And so people like to see our garden. So that's something that we've been able to offer outside as well. I just want to point out that this is our intern, Chris, and when he was working on the fence, he actually banged his finger. So one of the gardeners was there, and she had him put one of the herbs she rubbed on there to help stop the bleeding, and then a lamb's ear Band-Aid on top of it. So he's smiling there because the 18th century medicine worked, and that was kind of fun. We also offered a fall mum sale with an outdoor gift shop where we moved some of the items from the gift shop outside so that people could look at them. So as I said, we've been trying to do what we can. This was last season. This year we've been open. So another thing that we started last year during the pandemic is everyone has noticed that we have a beautiful backyard, large backyard. So we thought, why not have an outdoor lecture? So we did this last year. People were wearing masks. We had groups of people seated 6 feet apart. And then we had a screen set up where we brought a lecturer who talked about her particular area of expertise. This was actually sold out. We had 50 people there, and it was such a popular event that inspired an outdoor lecture series for this year. So we've actually had 3 lectures already this year in 2021. Here's, we put the screen in a different location, but this is the start of one of our lectures this summer. One of the challenges is that the sun doesn't go down until, quite late in the summer. So, they end up being a little bit later. We started this one at 7:30, but it does get very dark by the end of the lecture. And here you can see beautiful lighting and people enjoying a lecture. We did have to work on setting up a nice lighting system. You can see some examples of it. There's some volunteers setting it up. And this was a recent lecture we just had last week where this man came and talked about his book, White Pine. But you can see how beautiful it is and what a fun atmosphere for listening to an outdoor lecture. Here's our lighting. Another program we did last year is there's a Stroudwater Cemetery that's just down over the hill where many members of the Tate family and other people from the neighborhood are buried. So we did a program last year that was kind of we used the cemetery as a theater, is what I call it, where we had all these volunteers dress up in 18th century period pieces. And they actually were portraying different members of the Tate family and some of the neighbors. And we called it Buried Voices, Women of the 18th Century. Very often, as you know, men are portrayed historically because we know the most about them, but these were all women who were talking about different aspects of their lives. Here's me introducing the characters. We had 56 people in attendance. You can see the people in the back sat with masks on, and we had a microphone, so that this was our sort of makeshift stage. And it was really nice because it was like we had the ambiance of the cemetery as a background, and people just set blankets and chairs up looking down the hill. So it was a very popular event. We're hoping we can do it again this year. Another thing we did is, like everyone, we did several Zoom lectures. We had a very popular Mayflower II restoration. This man is Captain Whit Perry, who was involved in the restoration of the Mayflower, and we had 59 people who came to that, which is pretty good for a paid lecture. And so that helped the Tate House a lot. He worked for 3 years, I think, on renovating the Mayflower II, and then he sailed it back to Mayflower Harbor afterwards. So he talked about the process of Mayflower II restoration. Another thing we did in the spring is we had an apple tree pruning demonstration. This is the Means house that's across the road from the Tate House, and we have a lot of apple trees, so we had a nice event where people could come outside and learn about apple pruning. So one thing we didn't do this year, as a lot of people probably can imagine, we didn't have children. We've very much enjoyed having school-age children into the Tate House, but for safety reasons, we weren't able to do that at all. And we do have a lot of educational school-age children-related programs. So that was something we were not able to do and have not been able to pick up again yet. I just want to mention that maybe like a lot of organizations, the Tate House Museum runs on volunteers. We have all our docents, gardeners, board and committees, program planners and participants, all are volunteers. I'm the only paid staff member at the Tate House currently. So we really have a wonderful group of volunteers. These are all gardeners, enthusiastic gardeners. This is one of the docents. We took this picture because she and I were wearing a similar outfit that day, both white and blue striped lower part and blue. So anyway, we were laughing at that. So here's a picture. We actually, to celebrate our volunteers, we had a volunteer picnic. So here's some of our volunteers enjoying a meal together in the backyard, the lovely backyard of the Tate House. So now talk a little bit about the Tate House Museum into the future. We're going to continue with our educational mission, which, as I mentioned, primarily features tours, adults and also school-age children. We have had this season some AP students from the Scarborough High School, which is a local area high school, are coming in for tours. So we do offer a lot to school-age children as well. And so we've brought them back. We have the tours this year, limited numbers. People have to sign up and buy tickets in advance. We only allow up to 6 at a time. So we are still, and wearing masks, we have been able to open the Tate House this year. But our tour numbers are down about half what they were from pre-pandemic years. The other thing that we're working on and we want to continue doing are colonial programs as the pandemic allows, more lectures, another cemetery program, maybe a holiday photo shoot outside the Tate House. And we have a very, I haven't actually attended this, I've only been with the Tate House since 2020, mid 2020, but we have a colonial Christmas open house, which is really fun. I think we were all really hopeful that when people were vaccinated early in the year that we might be able to do that. But given the way the COVID is really spreading in Maine right now, so we don't know if we'll be able to do this or not. We're sort of waiting to see how we feel about it. Plus also our building preservation work to support our mission. So that's all things that we've been kind of continuing to do since 2005. But we also want to continue to broaden and grow. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things that we're thinking about for the future and how the Tate House can continue to grow and be more well known. So I recently gave a talk for the Stroughwater neighborhood. It turns out that the Tate House is, here is a map showing where we are, where the star is, and we are part of a larger historic district. So as I mentioned, when you looked at some of those early maps, we're not even the oldest house in the neighborhood. We're the oldest public public house, but there are several other houses here that are from the 1730s and 40s, one on the other side from the 1740s, and the whole neighborhood is a historic district. And so we're really hoping that, and over time, this is something that we are wanting to connect more with the Stroudwater Historic District, for them to really see Tate House as the heart and the center of the historic aspect of their neighborhood. And here's the cemetery that I was talking about, is also part of the historic district. So this whole neighborhood has very interesting and old history. As I said, that, that started here, in 1727, when Thomas Westbrook landed. So we're hoping to partner with them a little bit more. Here's a nice drone photo that was taken by Chris Roosevelt that shows, this is the Tate House here, and then this is the Means house that we own. So it's kind of a nice view, so you can see sort of how these are relative to each other. Remember that model that I showed you, when this house wasn't here when Tate first showed up. And in fact, as I mentioned, it was built in 1797. So William Tate still lived here at the time. And, we were thinking that I think he was kind of unhappy about that house because the river is here in the foreground. So, it really definitely disrupted his view of the river, but all these other houses have come up around the Tate House. So it looks very different than it did when he first settled here. But it is a beautiful neighborhood. Another thing we've been working on is marketing some swag, and swag would be different kinds of things. This is a magnet and some stickers and mugs that have our logo. So we have bumper stickers now. So that's something we're trying to get people more aware of the Tate House Museum, and so that's one way to do it. Here's some really, really fun marketing swag that we have. We have a wonderful advertising marketing person who's on our board. He's been sort of leading the charge on this, and he's been working for 40 years in advertising. So he came up with this idea of a Tate tote, which is really fun. So we now have an image of the Tate House on a Tate tote bag called the Tate tote. And I love this picture because this dog here is named Tate. And his owner went and purchased a Tate tote and told me that they had to have one because they had named the dog Tate after the Tate House. Reason being that this rock here that he's sitting on, this is a kind of a memorial stone describing when the Dames purchased the property. They actually purchased it I think it's August 26, 1931, and that's this dog's birthday. So that's why they decided to name the dog Tate, which I think is fun. She told me he's a registered Burmese mountain dog, and she told me that actually the dog's real name, registered name, is Masked Agent, which I think is really fun. So looking ahead for some of the things that we would like to continue to expand our narrative that is told in the Tate House is, we do mention this, but this is not something that we know a lot about. And we would like to research and develop interpretation, as many of the properties are now, colonial properties in particular, now looking at enslaved people. And we know that there was an enslaved person who lived at Tate House. And the reason that we know of her name was Bet, is, remember I mentioned that William had accidentally shot his mother? Well, when there was Bet was actually called as a witness in the trial. So we see her mentioned here. There's a number of neighbors that are also mentioned who they were summoned as witnesses in William's trial. And you see here, it says a Negro woman named Bet. And so this is why we know about her, is she actually appears in the records. And experts believe that because the Tate House was so large, it's likely that they had more than one enslaved person. And we know that there were other enslaved people who were living in the Stroudwater area at the time. Particularly, there was a tavern across the road that had several enslaved people working at the tavern. So that's an area of interpretation that we would like to expand. Another area that we'd like to expand is to research more about the Native Americans and Thomas Westbrook. This is a picture of the Stroudwater Dam, which, as I said, was originally set up. This is not Thomas Westbrook's version of it, but he originally dammed the Stroudwater River in the 1720s. And this is a picture of it in 1900. And so we actually know, we've got some records about Thomas Westbrook had some various problems with the Native people because of the fact that he was working on damming a lot of the rivers, and they were upset because it was affecting the fish that were trying to go upstream, and that was affecting their, source of food. And so anyway, there is some information about that, and that's something that we'd like to expand in our interpretation to learn more about Thomas Westbrook and the native people who obviously lived on the land well before any of the colonists came. And lastly, I just want to mention that there's new discoveries all the time. It's exciting to work at the Tate House because it's a rich source of history. And this was something we just discovered a couple of days ago down in one of the beams in the cellar. The guy, Otis Carroll, who had come to take some measurements for the windowsills, he said, "Oh, have you ever seen this?" And no, I mean, in recent history, none of our docents, our curator, who's been here since 1980, have seen this. And it's just because it's dark down there, but he happened to have a light on, and he noticed this says JCS Pinter, 1936. And that was the time period when the colonial dames were doing a lot of renovation. So he actually wrote that on the beam. His name is not anywhere in the records, but there he's recorded his name right there. So that's kind of a fun recent discovery. So thank you very much for your interest in the Tate House Museum, and I'm happy to entertain any questions if you have any.
Thank you, Holly. That was fascinating. And please type your questions into the chat box. I have a couple to get us started. Hold on, somebody's got a question. I'm gonna, anyway, we have a comment. Thank you for a wonderful program and very interesting. Going to Revolutionary War, back to George Tate, you say he stayed in Portland after the Revolution. Do you know much about how he might have been treated, or he didn't lose his property, or how he was able to stay?
Yeah, we don't know much about how he was treated, but because he lists himself as a merchant, he did have a store, and I assume that he continued, with his store, and he was able to, he probably, with shipping, as I said, one of his sons was a ship captain. He probably just moved to different kinds of merchant activities that he was able to do. And why was he able to stay? He actually, at least one of his sons actually served in the American Revolution. So that's why we know he was a patriot. So I think that he could maybe argue that, he was engaged in the patriot cause, and he was a well-known and well-established merchant in the area. So he was somehow able to have relations with people such that he was able to stay. So that's about all we know about it. But that is interesting, isn't it?
And now, the house is clapboard. Is it pine?
It's not pine.
Okay.
I don't know if I know what it is. It's called a feathered. It's the edges are feathered like this. It's unpainted, and it never has been painted. That's the natural way that it existed, although it's been redone. That's the way that the Tates had it. So it's never been painted, and that's what it looks like.
And what is the roof? The roof is wooden shingles?
Yeah,
or?
Those are cedar shakes.
Okay.
White cedar shakes. Which is something that grows in Maine. So it's a natural cedar shake.
Okay. And as far as the gambrel design of the roof, was some of that to help with like snow not sitting on the roof all winter, and or just that was just the design of homes at that point?
Well, it was unusual. Like I said, we
Yeah.
only know of one other house that is like that. People say that Tate would have been able to look all the way down to where the mass ships were loading at Clark's Point. Of course, you can't see anything like that now, but the house is very tall. So on the third floor, we think one of the reasons it was open is to just provide, kind of a view. I mean, it is up on a hill, so it's quite the view from the third floor. And probably, again, it's a sign of opulence. He was a wealthy merchant, and, 3 stories on a house with all those windows on the front. A sign of wealth.
Okay. Have any famous people visited your house or stayed there? That is a
You mean like George
Which is-
Washington?
Yeah. Or
The only,
more recent.
yeah, not that we know of. I mean,
Okay.
presumably he would have entertained Benning Wentworth and some of the people involved in the mass trade down in Portsmouth. So locally well-known or wealthier people, you know, people in, he definitely was, you know, entertaining people of his class, because it was very much about class during that time period, and he was wealthy. So, but nobody particularly famous. We know that the Means house across the way, James Means actually served in the American Revolution with Lafayette. And we say that it's possible that Lafayette would have at least visited James Means when he came to Maine in 1830. And so it's possible that Lafayette may have visited the Means house across the way, but no one else that we know of with respect to George Tate.
Okay. What wood is used for the window cornices? They never turn darker?
They never turn darker. Well, they're actually, those are painted. The window cornices are painted. That sort of, it's called yellow ochre. It's a beautiful color. People very frequently ask us what that color is on the door and the windows, around the windows, because they love it. It's a very, I don't know if it came out in the photographs, but it's a rich color. And the color is based on, we had a historic paint analysis done. And so we know that some of the paint colors that we're using are accurate to the time period. And but those are made of either white oak, or I think the reconstructions might be mahogany, which is a harder wood to try to last. They were originally pine. The ones that are being replaced were pine. And it's amazing that some of those have lasted as long as they have.
And the flooring inside, those wide planks, are those pine?
Yeah, for the most part, yes.
Yeah. In the comments, we're also seeing thanking you for all the great pandemic ideas. I think we're all still, you know, having to work through that. We do have some dames in Tennessee who were on the call today. So y'all have done some wonderful programming to work through the pandemic. Are you open just seasonally? Are you open during the winter months, or?
We're just open seasonally from June to October, because I mean, we do have heating in the house, but it's a minor amount of heating. So we actually close the house down in October. Yeah, so that's what we do. And that's when we have most visitors. Most of our visitors are out of state. We do have some local visitors, but a huge number of people who are coming to Portland who want to learn about the history are coming from out of state. And yes, I think one of the things that's required for your outdoor lectures is beautiful grounds. And I think that's how we got that idea, is that, you know, like in Portland, they've got the Wadsworth Longfellow House. I mean, they don't have any area that they could do something outside. So we just realized we're very blessed to have that wonderful yard. Why don't we use it, you know? And like I said, it's been very successful, but.
Yeah. I loved the buried voices idea too, the women of the 18th century. That looks like a really great program.
Thank you.
I had another question. Oh, what would the L have been used for?
You know, that's a good question that we all discuss all the time. Our curator, Laura Sprague, thinks that it would have been sort of an office area. The area I mentioned as the sitting room also could have been an area that he would have entertained guests in sort of business way. Laura thinks that it probably was an office. I actually have another idea that, and my idea was actually supported by Walter Macomber as well. One of the things that when I was reading about it is I noted that it was torn down in the 18th century. And as you know, it was built in the 18th century. So I thought, why would you tear down a perfectly good building? Laura thinks it's because it was after the mass trade ended. And so he wasn't doing that kind of business. So it wasn't needed. Still, to me, you know, if it was torn down 20, 30 years after it was built, you know, why would you do that? Because it would have been a good structure. I actually was wondering if it was the storehouse where Mary, the underground part could have been the storehouse where Mary Tate was killed. And that would have been a pretty good reason to remove a structure for the, you know, the sort of the bad blood associated with it. And I had that idea and I was talking to Laura about it and she says, no. But then when I looked at the original records, actually Macomber himself thought that that was the case, because the archaeology actually shows that it was torn down between 1770 and 1780, like in that decade. And she died in 1770. So, and that is literally 15 years after it was built. And again, why would you tear down that structure? So my theory, but I'm maybe the only one, and Matt Comber, who's long gone, who might think it's the case. So it's possible that they tore it down for that reason. But we might not ever know unless we have more evidence.
All right. Does anybody have any other questions to ask Holly? Yes. Well, I would like to thank you again, Holly. That was a fascinating talk. A little bit of everything, history of Portland, of the house, and then some great ideas on how we keep going through the pandemic. Because here at the Powder Magazine, we rely a good bit on school groups, and we were hopeful at the beginning of the summer that they might start coming back, but at this point, we're not really expecting any for a little while yet. So. Right. Just hearing other sites' ideas, and then also the issues of preservation that you have, because I know the colonial dames who are working with properties are always concerned about how to maintain them. So this has just been a fabulous presentation, and we thank you very much for taking the time to do this. And those of you who are still on the call, keep your eyes open for our next Second Cup conversation on October 31st when we visit Whitehall in Rhode Island, and we're really looking forward to that. So unless there are no other questions, we'll wish you all well and hope we'll see you again in about 4 weeks. So
thank you all, and I hope you'll visit the Tate House if you're in the Portland, Maine area.
I will definitely be there next summer.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, everyone. Good luck with your properties and your interests.
All right. Thank you, Holly.